No end in sight. Once again, Washington had barely escaped disaster. And while that was something to be grateful for, the entire country was getting sick and tired of this war. The American Revolution entered its seventh year in 1781. With no end in sight, the government didn't even have enough money to pay its soldiers. One day in February, Washington was walking up the stairs at his headquarters. Halfway up the staircase, he met his 21-year-old assistant, Alexander Hamilton, who was coming down. Washington told Hamilton he needed help right away with some important papers. I answered that I would wait on him immediately, Hamilton later said. Washington went to his office and sat down. He waited, no Hamilton. Washington stepped out into the hall and started pacing back and forth about above the staircase. His impatience turned to anger, and his anger bubbled towards the boiling point. Finally, he spotted Hamilton at the bottom of the stairs. Washington, Colonel Hamilton, you have kept me waiting at the head of the stairs these 10 minutes. I must tell you, sir, you retreat me with disrespect. Hamilton said, I am not conscious of it, sir, but since you thought it necessary to tell me so we part. And the young man turned and walked away. Less than an hour later, Washington sent an apology to Hamilton, blaming his outburst on a moment of passion. Hamilton accepted the apology and came back to work. But it was clear that the never-ending stress was starting to affect George Washington, and everyone else too. Joseph Plum Martin spoke for the entire United States when he said, I saw no likelihood that the war would ever end. The Great Race to Yorktown. The year 1781 started out badly for George Washington. In early spring, a British warship sailed up the Potomac River in Virginia and docked at Mount Vernon, Washington's beloved home and plantation. Lund Washington, who was running the plantation while his cousin George was away at war, hurried down to the dock to see what was going on. Refreshments for the enemy. When Lund Washington got down to the river, he saw that 17 slaves had already seized the chance to escape from Mount Vernon by hopping onto the British ship. Then Lund heard the British sailors calling out for service. Bring us food and drink, they demanded, or we'll burn the plantation. Lund did as he was told. When Washington heard the news, he didn't seem too upset that the slaves had run away, but he was horribly ashamed that his own form had provided supplies to the invading enemy. As he told Lund, that which gives me most concern is that you should go on board the enemy's vessels and furnish them with refreshments. It would have been a less painful circumstance to me to have heard that in consequence of your non-compliance with their request they had burnt my house and laid the plantation in ruins. Another wasted year. And speaking of Washington's troubles, here was his biggest one. It was looking like 1781 was going to be another wasted year, yet another year without a major attack on the British. At this time, Washington and his army were camped just north of New York City. So was a French army of about 4,000 men under the command of a general known to his friends as the Count de Rochambeau. Washington had been hoping that this year, finally, the Americans and French would launch a serious attack on the British in New York City. So Washington and Rochambeau spent most of the July looking through telescopes, studying the British forts in New York City. They were hoping to find a weak spot to attack. There didn't seem to be a weak spot, though. Washington was used to disappointments, but this one really got to him. How could he ever win this war? He was having a hard time just holding his army together. And that's when it happened. Washington suddenly saw a way to win the American Revolution, and he could do it right now. He just had to race his army 450 miles south to a place called Yorktown, Virginia. Why the race to Yorktown? That question really needs a 9-part answer. Part 1, the King tries the South. The first thing we have to do is to take a look at things from King George's point of view. Mighty Great Britain had been fighting these pesky Americans since 1775, and all they had to show for it was control of New York City, The war was costing Britain a fortune, so much the government had to raise taxes. King George was feeling the heat. More and more people in Britain were sick of war. They wanted to bring the army home and forget the whole thing. But you know George, he was still absolutely committed to victory over the Americans. So starting in 1779, the king decided to try a new strategy. The British army would destroy the revolution by capturing the southern states. The famously stubborn King George honestly believed that most people in the South were still loyal to him. Port 2, Bad Peaches, Bad General. At first, it looked like Britain's southern strategy was actually going to work. The British quickly captured big chunks of Georgia and South Carolina. Then Congress put Horatio Gates, the Saratoga hero, in charge of the American army in the South. Gates showed up in the camp in July 1780 and saw that his soldiers were starving and exhausted. So what did he decide to do? He ordered them to march right toward the British. Hungry enough to eat anything, the men spotted unripened green peaches growing along the road. They feasted and quickly paid the price. The meal had painful effects, said Colonel Otho Williams. That was a polite way of putting it. Let's say the peaches didn't stay in those hungry bellies for long. Gates pushed his weakened soldiers on, and on August 16th, they ran into British General Charles Cornwallis and his army at Camden, South Carolina. While Cornwallis was crushing the Americans, General Gates panicked and fled from the battlefield, leaving the entire army behind. He was next seen 180 miles away. Was there ever an instance of a general running away, as Gates had done, from his whole army? Wondered Alexander Hamilton, Washington's young assistant. So far, so good, thought King George. Part 3, British behaving badly. If only the king knew how badly some of his soldiers were behaving in the South. One morning in 1780, a frightened girl came up to Eliza Wilkinson's South Carolina home. "Oh, the king's people are coming," shouted the girl. "It must be them, for they are all in red." Moments later, Eliza saw a group of British soldiers riding up to her house. "Where are these women rebels? Where are these women rebels?" they cried, waving swords and pistols. The soldiers jumped off their horses, ran into the house, and started stealing stuff: jewelry, clothes, pretty much anything that wasn't nailed down. Then one of the soldiers saw the silver buckles on Eliza's shoes. "I want them buckles," said he, and immediately knelt at my feet to take them out. Which, while he was busy about, a brother villain, whose enormous mouth extended from ear to ear, bawled out, "Shares there! I say shares!" So they divided my buckles between them. A few minutes later, it was all over. Eliza watched the British soldiers ride off, their shirts bulging with loot. This kind of thing was happening a lot. And so you can imagine the British bandits were not exactly winning new friends for King George in the South. In fact, more and more Southern patriots began rising up against the invaders. Port 4, the Swamp Fox. That brings us to South Carolina patriot named Francis Marion. Marion started leading small bands of militia members on quick surprise strikes against British soldiers. Marion would march through the night, attack sleepy British soldiers at dawn, then disappear into the forests and swamps, using paths and hiding places the British could never find. Marion never encamped over 2 nights in one place, said Tarleton Brown, one of Marion's men. The British hated Marion, and they couldn't help respecting his creative and daring style. They even gave him a nickname, the Swamp Fox. Even Continental Army soldiers hardly ever got a good look at the Swamp Fox. When Colonel Otho Williams met Marion and his swamp team, he was surprised to see a bunch of hungry-looking men in rags. The numbers did not exceed 20 men and boys, said Williams, some white, some black, and all mounted on horses, but most of them miserably equipped. Miserably equipped, but very effective. With folks like the Swamp Fox around, the British Army was never able to gain control of the South. Port 5, fight, lose, fight again. General Nathanael Greene took command of the American army in the South at the end of the 1780s, and like the Swamp Fox, Greene knew how to use geography to his advantage. His strategy was simple: we fight, get beat, rise, and fight again. Doesn't exactly sound like a formula for success, does it? Actually, it was brilliant. Greene knew his small army wasn't strong enough to actually beat the British, so instead he decided to lead the army on a long and tiring chase all over the vast spaces of North and South Carolina. Once in a while, he'd turn and fight a small battle, and he didn't mind losing these fights because he knew he was wearing the British down. Don't get the idea that Greene's army was having a great time, though. Facing the usual Continental Army food shortages, the soldiers ate frogs, alligators, or anything else they could catch and cook. And with all the marching and camping, the men wore completely through their clothes by summer's end. At the Battle of Eutaw Springs, said General Greene, hundreds of men were naked as they were born. Well, at least it was warm. Port 6, Cornwallis gets tired. Over in the British camp, Greene's strategy was having its intended effect. At first, General Charles Cornwallis was determined to catch up to Greene. He ordered his men to toss away all their extra supplies, tents, clothing, even barrels of rum. He hoped this would let his army march faster. And it did, though the soldiers were very angry about the wasted rum. But Greene always managed to stay a step ahead of Cornwallis. And by the end of 1781, Cornwallis was frustrated, angry, and exhausted. He reported, "With a third of my army sick and wounded, the remainder without shoes, and worn down with fatigue, I thought it was time to look for some place to rest." So Cornwallis decided to push his army north. Maybe, he hoped, the British would have better luck in Virginia. Port 7, spying on Cornwallis. Soon after the British entered Virginia, a 21-year-old named James Armistead decided to help kick them out. But first he had to get permission from his owner. Armistead was held as a slave on a farm near Williamsburg. The owner agreed, and Armistead marched to the American camp. Armistead met with a young French general, the Marquis de Lafayette, only 23 himself. Lafayette explained that what the army really needed was more information about the location and movements of Cornwallis's army. Would Armistead be willing to take a massive risk to get this information? A few days later, Armistead walked into General Cornwallis's camp and told the British soldier he was an escaped slave looking to earn some cash. The British put him to work. This young guy proved to be very useful to the British. He detailed knowledge of the local geography, helped the soldiers find their way around. All the while, James Armistead was sending reports back to Lafayette in the American camp. Then Armistead took an even bigger risk. He gained the trust of General Cornwallis and took the job of Cornwallis's personal waiter. This was the perfect position for a spy. Serving food and walking around the dinner table, Armistead was able to see and hear everything that went on in Cornwallis's own tent. Armistead always had a hard time getting a close look at official maps and plans because Cornwallis was so careful with his papers. As Lafayette explained, his Lordship Cornwallis is so shy of his papers that my honest friend says he cannot get at them. Armistead kept working, though, and he kept feeding badly needed information to Lafayette. This helped the Americans keep as close watch on Cornwallis as he marched his army around Virginia. But exactly where was Cornwallis headed? Port 8, pick a port, any port. The truth is, even Cornwallis didn't know. All summer long, he exchanged angry letters with General Henry Clinton, the British commander in New York City. Like most top British generals in this war, these two guys couldn't stand each other. Clinton wanted Cornwallis to come north to New York because he was sure Washington was about to attack him there. Cornwallis wanted Clinton to come south to Virginia because he was convinced the British could capture this important state. They finally agreed on a compromise. Cornwallis would take control of a port town on the Virginia coast. That way, British ships could move soldiers quickly back and forth between New York and Virginia. So Cornwallis started looking for a good port. He picked a tiny town near the Chesapeake Bay. "Welcome to Yorktown, General Cornwallis." Port 9, the French sail north. Now there's just one last piece of the Yorktown puzzle. As Cornwallis was settling in at Yorktown, a fleet of French warships started sailing north from the Caribbean Sea. The commander of the fleet, Count de Grasse, thought he might be able to help with the war. His destination, the Chesapeake Bay. Now back to Washington. And at last, we're ready to return to George Washington. Last we saw him, his face was bright with excitement, and this is why. Down in Yorktown, Cornwallis and his entire army were in a trap, and the best part was they didn't know it. It was just a question of timing. If Washington could quickly march his army south to Virginia, he could surround Yorktown by land, and if the French warships could control the Chesapeake Bay, they could surround Yorktown by water. Of course, all this had to happen before Cornwallis realized the deadly danger of his position. We have not a moment to lose, Washington said. The race was on. The trap slammed shut. Our destination has been for some time a matter of perplexing doubt and uncertainty, wrote Dr. James Thatcher as he marched south with Washington's army. The soldiers actually placed bets on where they were headed. This confusion was just what Washington wanted. He needed the British to believe he was moving his soldiers into position to attack New York City. He even had his engineers build huge bread ovens around New York. This helped trick General Clinton into believing the Americans were planning to stay for the rest of the year. Meanwhile, Washington continued racing his army toward Virginia. As far as he knew, Cornwallis was still at Yorktown. But where was that French fleet? He could get no update from the French naval commander, Count de Grasse. I am distressed beyond expression to know what is become of the Count de Grasse, he said, but there was no way to communicate with ships at sea. On September 5th, just south of Philadelphia, a messenger brought Washington a stack of letters. He opened them and started reading. At this very moment, General Rochambeau's boat was rowing up to the American camp. Rochambeau looked toward the shore and witnessed a very strange sight. I caught sight of General Washington waving his hat at me with gestures of the greatest joy. As Rochambeau stepped off the boat, Washington ran up to the Frenchman, hugged him, and told him the news. 28 French warships had just arrived in the Chesapeake Bay and were now surrounding Yorktown by water. Washington rushed his army onto Yorktown and slammed the trap shut on Cornwallis. We have him handsomely in a pudding bag, announced the American General George Wheaton. Huzzah for the Americans! More than 7,000 British and German soldiers suddenly found themselves surrounded at Yorktown. Cornwallis begged Clinton to send help immediately. If you cannot relieve me very soon, he wrote, you must be prepared to hear the worst. But with French ships controlling the Chesapeake Bay, British ships couldn't get anywhere near Yorktown. At least Cornwallis still had his trusted waiter, James Armistead. And in this desperate situation, Cornwallis asked Armistead for a remarkable favor. He asked Armistead to go spy on the Americans. Armistead gladly took the job. He snuck over to the American camp and reported to General Lafayette. Now, as one of the country's first double agents, Armistead was able to move easily back and forth between the British and American camps. He gave Lafayette key intelligence and fed Cornwallis information that was useless or just plain wrong. Meanwhile, Washington tightened the rope around Cornwallis's neck by inching his soldiers closer and closer to Yorktown. It's fitting that James Plum Martin, after 6 long years in the army, was here at Yorktown for the final battle. On October 8th, Martin and the rest of the army proudly watched the raising of an American flag, the signal to begin blasting cannonballs into Yorktown. Martin reported, about noon, the much-wished-for signal went up. I confess I felt a secret pride swell my heart when I saw the Star-Spangled Banner waving majestically. Huzzah for the Americans, shouted the French soldiers. Then about 100 Americans and French cannons opened fire. The French cannons smashed right into buildings in Yorktown. Many of the American cannonballs plopped into the river or landed in empty fields. The French had a lot more practice at this stuff. The British shot back with everything they had, and the fire-tailed cannonballs crossed each other in the air. Washington stood out in the open, watching the bombs explode in Yorktown. An officer named David Cobb urged the commander to be more careful. Cobb said. Sir, you are too much exposed here. Had you not better step a little back? Washington replied. Colonel Cobb, if you are afraid, you have liberty to step back. Washington had worked 7 long years for this moment. He wasn't going to miss it for anything.